The Influence of Latin on the English Language by Ben, Clark, Matt, and Minwoo. There are several branches in the Indo-European family tree. Different sources disagree on the number of branches and the names of different branches, but in most sources the 7 major branches are Hellenic, Celtic, Germanic, Baltic Slavic, Iranian, Indic, and Italic. Latin belongs in the Italic branch of the Indo-European family tree, sometimes referred to as the Latin or Romance branch. There were several historic events that led to the adoption of Latin words into English. The spread of Christianity to Great Britain, the advent of the printing press, and the Renaissance are major historical events that brought many Latin words into English. Christianity was introduced to Great Britain in 597 AD. Christianity brought churches and monasteries to Great Britain, as well as Latin. Latin words gradually made their way into English from 597 AD, when Christianity was introduced, to 500 years later at the end of the Old English period. Latin words relating to Christianity were often adopted into English, as they expressed new ideas. Since Christian ideas were new, there were no words in English to describe these new concepts, so that is why Latin words were adopted. Some examples of these adopted words are angel, anthem, priest, and psalm. A major factor in the development of English was the advent of the printing press. In 1476, William Caxton brought the first printing press to England. The printing press caused many things to happen. First, printing meant that books were cheaper, since they were easier to make. Books became cheaper due to the fact that they were easier to make, causing books to be more easily obtainable. Now that more people are able to have books, there is also more literacy. The printing press also helped to standardize English. Because books needed to be printed, there needed to be proper ways to spell words. Many books printed were books written in different languages translated into English. When books originally written in Latin were translated into English, many Latin words came into English in this way. As new ideas needed to be explained, English adopted Latin words to describe these new ideas. The Renaissance also brought in many classical Latin words into English. The English Renaissance covers about the 16th and 17th century. There was great enthusiasm for the classical languages during the English Renaissance, and Latin was still considered the language of education and scholarship. This caused many new words to be brought into English. Many classical works were being translated into English at this time, and as new ideas and terms were introduced, English adopted Latin words because they lacked in many words that Latin had. Some examples of Latin words that were adopted during this period are genius, species, militia, and radius.
Latin influenced English in a very different way from how the French and Viking languages influenced English. While the French and Vikings influenced by conquest, the Romans influenced it by indirect contact and religion. First, the Romans influenced the English through indirect contact. Though the Romans at one point did rule over English land, at that time they were not very civilized, and therefore the conquest did not have much effect on language. When the Romans left the area of Britain in the 400s, Britain and specifically the English language still hadn't changed much. However, when the Vikings and French took over, they had been influenced much by Latin, and so as the English were conquered, Latin rubbed off on them more this time because the English people had developed much more. Next, the Romans spread their language through their religion. In Europe, Christianity became a huge religion, and as Rome was the main hub for years under the Byzantine Empire, Latin was considered by most Christians at the time, and still to many Christians is today, as the language of the religion. And obviously, if your religion's language was Latin, it would be rather important to learn it. The French and Viking languages are not languages of a specific religion.
Latin is an inflected language, so one word can have many forms. Not all of these forms still survive in English, but there are a few typical ones. First, words formed with a genitive case stem, such as words like itinerary or part, come from pars and iter, which are not the genitive stems. Probably The genitive stem forms were used a lot more, and so they stuck. Usually for verbs, it is the participial stem that comes in English. This is very common in English of verbs of Latin origins. They often end in ate or some variant of it, as many Latin participles take this form. Also, some nouns and adjectives are formed with this stem, such as captive and capture from capturus, the future participle of capio capere. Another form which shows up in English is the diminutive. This form is used for a small version of something. An example is the Latin word pars, meaning part. The diminutive is particula, and so this means a little part. This comes into English as the word particle. The same happened with globus, meaning globe, which eventually became globule. Many Latin diphthongs were dropped as they came into English. A few examples are I and oi, which have changed simply to e, such as celestial, fetus, and pedagogue. Many word endings came into English from Latin through French. A few examples are words ending in ty or ity, ence, and tion. Ty words ultimately come from Latin, but the ty ending comes from French. It is different from all the other Romance languages. As can be seen, the Latin is libertas, libertatis, French liberté, and English liberty. Then are ence words, or sometimes just nce. In Latin, it was tnta, and this comes to French and English nce. So in words like intelligentsia, which changes into intelligence. Tion words also come from French. The Latin, it was io, and then ions, such as in natio, nationis. Sometimes and in French, this became nation, and it has different forms in the different languages. In words like confession, the same thing happened. There's a wealth of information that can be gathered from English words that have Latin and French counterparts, such as incant and enchant, the former being Latin and the latter French. A few examples are canter, enchant, regal versus royal, vigil versus veil, and candle versus chandelier. As can be seen from these examples, the French words often have experienced considerable consonantal softening. There are a few points to be taken from these examples. Special forms of Latin words are the ones which survive in English. The shape of these words is heavily influenced by French, as they are closer to French than other Romance languages, and French-influenced Latin words often feature consonant softening and vowel modification. In Latin and French counterparts, the French usually has evolved in the aforementioned ways. French brought many words into English. However, they usually take up a special part of the English vocabulary.
The English vocabulary that comes from Latin is generally vocabulary that is not used in everyday language, and is usually only used in formal settings, although as a whole English is still very heavily influenced by Latin. Many derivatives of Latin words that have attempted to make their way into English are what we refer to as inkhorn terms. An inkhorn term is an obscure word or phrase that is essentially extinct in modern everyday language. An example of an inkhorn term is the word ingent, meaning immense or very great. This word caught my eye because in Latin we have learned a similar word, ingens, ingentus, meaning huge. As you can see, there is a quite clear connection between the two words, and this is just one of many examples of obscure English words that are derived from Latin. Approximately 60% of English vocabulary is either derived directly from Latin or is derived indirectly from a Romance language. Around 29% of English vocabulary comes directly from Latin, and around 29% comes from French, which was heavily influenced by Latin itself. Many Latin words and word roots are found in SAT vocabulary. An example of this is the common Latin word bene, meaning good or well. Bene is a word root for quite a few common SAT vocab words such as benefactor, benevolent, and benediction. It is a common study tactic to learn word roots such as bene, because as you can see, the words that come from it have very similar definitions. Aside from being found commonly throughout SAT vocabulary, Latin is also very common in medical, scientific, and legal vocabulary. As we learned about in biology class earlier this year, the scientific naming system for organisms uses binomial nomenclature, a classification system that primarily uses Latin. So this brings up the question, why does Latin not seem to influence everyday vocabulary, but rather formal vocabulary, medical vocabulary, scientific vocabulary, and so on? There are a few possible explanations for this, especially for why Latin was the language of choice for scientific and medical vocabulary. The first explanation gives credit to a man we also learned about in biology earlier this year, Carl Linnaeus, or as he referred to himself, Carolus Linnaeus. He created a classification system for organisms, gave living things two-part scientific names, classified organisms based on structure, and so on, using Latin for all of this. The other two common explanations are rather obvious. Latin is a dead language, so it does not change and is not biased towards any specific political entity. And the Romans, who were responsible for many of the medical, legal, and scientific advances of their time, had a large sphere of influence, so it is logical that their language would become the one most commonly used for medical, scientific, and legal vocabulary. To conclude, Latin has made a significant impact on the English language. It has uniquely impacted English both directly and indirectly through French, the Renaissance, and religion.